There was a time when faith itself was outlawed, when a single prayer could mean death, when soldiers stormed through the temple, dragging families into the streets, demanding worship to gods they did not believe in. Picture a mother, standing before her 7 sons one by one. They are offered life. If they would only bow one by one, they refuse. Imagine a nation trembling under a tyrant who called himself God Manifest. A people caught between surrender and extinction, and yet, in their darkest hour, they chose faith. These are not legends. These are the forgotten pages of history, the 4 books of Maccabees. Over the next 40 minutes, you will witness courage that defied empires, reason that conquered fear, and devotion that outlived death itself. If you believe that one person's faith can still shake the world, subscribe now, and walk this journey with me. The world had changed. The mighty Alexander of Macedon had swept across nations like a storm, and when he died, his empire shattered into fragments ruled by his generals. Judea, a small land of faith and covenant, found itself trapped between 2 Greek empires, the Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria. Greek language became the tongue of trade. Greek gods stood in marble over conquered cities. Greek philosophy, art, and politics promised enlightenment, but at a price, the loss of identity. In Jerusalem, young men abandoned the sacred covenant to build gymnasiums, to compete naked as the Greeks did. Priests adopted Greek names, Greek customs, Greek thoughts. For many, the law of Moses was no longer sacred. It was an obstacle. But others held firm. They remembered the words written in stone, the fire on Sinai, the covenant that made them a people set apart. The tension was unbearable. Would they preserve the law or adapt to survive? From this cultural collision emerged one of the most intense and defining struggles in Jewish history. A struggle that birthed 4 books, each bearing one name, Maccabees. But what are these books? There are 4 main writings, 4 windows into the soul of a nation under siege. The first book of Maccabees, a historical chronicle of war and liberation, a record of rebellion against oppression. The second book of Maccabees, not just history but theology, miracles, martyrdom, and the mystery of life beyond death. The third book of Maccabees, set not in Judea, but in Egypt, showing how faith endured persecution even far from home. And the fourth book of Maccabees, a philosophical masterpiece, proclaiming that reason guided by faith can conquer even pain and fear. Not all traditions kept these books. The Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches hold 1 and 2 Maccabees as sacred, deuterocanonical, meaning divinely inspired but preserved outside the Hebrew canon. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church includes even the third. The fourth, often debated, stands as a profound sermon more than a story, a bridge between faith and philosophy. Yet, whether accepted or hidden, all 4 testify to one truth. When the world demanded compromise, a small people refused to bow. This is not just history, it's a mirror. Because every generation faces the same question. When the world tempts you to blend in, will you stand apart? So as we begin this journey through faith, blood, and courage, ask yourself, what would you choose when obedience to God costs everything? Now let's begin where the fires first rose. In the first book of Maccabees, rebellion ignites and revival begins. Chapter 1, 1 Maccabees, the revolt and rise of the Hasmoneans. History remembers this moment as the spark that refused to die. The first book of Maccabees begins like a record written by a survivor, measured, disciplined, yet burning beneath the surface. Though the original Hebrew is lost, its voice echoes through a Greek translation preserved by generations of believers. Scholars tell us it was likely written by a Jewish court historian, someone close enough to feel the pulse of the Hasmonean family, yet steady enough to chronicle their rise. It is one of the few ancient works that bridges eyewitness testimony, oral memory, and political record, a rare window into Judea's civil wars and the birth of a dynasty. But before rebellion came terror. When Antiochus IV Epiphanes ascended the Seleucid throne in 175 BC, he saw Judea not as a holy nation, but as a stubborn province. To secure loyalty, he demanded uniformity. Greek worship, Greek laws, Greek gods. He renamed himself Theos Epiphanes, God Manifest. And under his rule, sacred scrolls were burned. Circumcision was outlawed. Mothers who kept the covenant watched their infants slaughtered before their eyes. The Temple of Jerusalem, the very heart of their faith, was desecrated with swine's blood and idols of Zeus. Yet the empire's cruelty was not its sharpest weapon. Its greatest threat came from within. Many of Judea's own elites embraced the new culture. Hellenized priests, Jason Menelaus, took power, abandoned the Torah, and turned worship into politics. It was no longer a war between Jew and Greek. It was a war within the soul of Israel. Then, in the small village of Modian, one priest refused to kneel. His name was Mattathias. When the king's officer demanded sacrifice to an idol, Mattathias shouted, "Though all nations obey the king and forsake the laws of their fathers, yet I and my sons will walk in the covenant of our God." When a fellow Jew stepped forward to obey, Mattathias struck him down, and the royal agent with him. Blood hit the altar, and history shifted course. He fled into the mountains with his 5 sons, calling out to all who loved the law, "Whoever is zealous for God, follow me." From the wilderness, a movement was born. A people of faith turned warriors of necessity. After Mattathias' death, leadership passed to his son Judas, nicknamed Maccabeus, the Hammer. Against overwhelming odds, Judas led a guerrilla campaign across Judea. Swift strikes, ambushes, night raids. Villages once silent with fear now rang with battle cries of "For the law! For our fathers!" The Seleucid generals came with armor, elephants, and thousands of men. Judas came with a remnant, armed with conviction. And then, the impossible happened. Jerusalem was taken back. The idols were torn down, the altar cleansed, the temple rededicated. The lamps burned again, the menorah's light flickering through smoke and prayer. That moment would become the festival of Hanukkah, the feast of dedication, a celebration not of conquest, but of perseverance. But their fight did not end there. After Judas fell in battle, his brothers Jonathan and Simon carried the cause forward. Jonathan balanced warfare with diplomacy, playing empires against one another, gaining time and territory. Simon, the last surviving brother, completed the work. By 135 BC, Judea stood free, its own ruler, its own priest, its own destiny. The Hasmonean dynasty was born. Yet freedom carried its own shadows. Power bred division. The family that liberated Judea would later fall to pride and internal conflict. Still, the message of 1 Maccabees remains unbroken. Faith can spark revolutions. Conviction can outlast empires, and one act of courage can echo for centuries. So I ask you, if faith were outlawed tomorrow, would you stand, or would you hide? If you believe history preserves more than politics, that it preserves faith itself, hit subscribe now, and tell me your answer in the comments. Because what comes next is not just about victory, it's about the cost of it. In 2 Maccabees, we'll see what faith truly demands: martyrdom, miracles, and hope that even death could not silence. Chapter 2, 2 Maccabees, Martyrs, Miracles, and Theology. The second book of Maccabees opens not like a chronicle, but like a sermon. It tells us, right from the beginning, that it is not the full story, but a condensed account, an abridgment of a 5-volume history written by a man named Jason of Cyrene. Jason had recorded the long, tangled wars of faith and politics, but the author of 2 Maccabees distills them to their soul, to the spiritual meaning behind the events. Unlike 1 Maccabees, written in Hebrew with the weight of history, 2 Maccabees was written in Greek, the language of philosophers, poets, and empire, yet within its pages burns a defiance no empire could contain. Where the first book tells of victories, this one tells of virtues. Where the first shows strategy, this one shows sacrifice. It is emotional, dramatic, and deeply theological, a tapestry of miracles, prayers, and resurrection hope that would influence generations of believers. It begins with a story meant to shock the reader's imagination. A royal official named Eleazar arrives in Jerusalem, ordered to seize the temple treasury, that he enters arrogantly, soldiers at his side, intent on looting what was dedicated to God. But as he approaches the inner sanctuary, something happens. The book says he is struck down by a vision, a horseman in shining armor, and 2 angelic warriors, that he collapses, terrified, begging for mercy. When he awakens, he confesses that the God of the temple is no ordinary deity, and withdraws. From the first chapter, 2 Maccabees makes its message clear. The unseen hand of God protects his own. Yet, the greater threat to faith still came from within. 2 priests, Jason and Menelaus, coveted the high priesthood. They bought it from Antiochus with bribes, replacing holiness with politics. Their corruption turned the temple into a marketplace, and their betrayal invited foreign armies to march through its gates. When Antiochus returned from Egypt humiliated, he unleashed his fury on Jerusalem, slaughtering thousands, defiling the altar, and erecting a statue of Zeus within the temple itself. It was in these years that faith became resistance, and resistance became worship. Among the faithful stood Eleazar, an aged teacher of the law. Soldiers commanded him to eat pork, forbidden under the covenant that he could have pretended, could have saved his life with a lie. But instead he refused. He said, "It is not fitting for our years to dissemble, lest the young think we abandon the law." And he was beaten to death, his courage a sermon written in blood. Then comes one of the most haunting scenes in all ancient literature, the story of a mother and her 7 sons. They are arrested together, each commanded to break the law by eating pork. Each refuses point one by one. They are tortured and killed before her eyes. Yet the mother's voice never trembles. She tells them, "Do not fear this executioner, my sons. The Creator, who made you, will restore your life again in mercy." It is here that faith first declares something unthinkable for its time, that death is not the end, that there is resurrection, a life beyond suffering, a justice beyond the grave. This mother becomes a symbol for every believer who ever whispered through tears, "God still reigns." And in the backdrop of this faith, Judas Maccabeus still fights on. His victories, like the defeat of the Seleucid general Nicanor, are portrayed not as military brilliance, but as proof that heaven itself fought for them. Angels appear in battle, visions strengthen hearts. Every victory is an act of divine favor. But 2 Maccabees goes further still. It introduces ideas that will echo into later theology: prayer for the dead, intercession for the fallen, and the assurance that righteousness is never forgotten. When Judas discovers fallen soldiers wearing pagan amulets, he prays for their souls, asking God to show mercy, an act unheard of in older Hebrew texts. It suggests that the faithful dead are not gone, but waiting in the presence of God. Through all of this, 2 Maccabees reminds us, suffering is not meaningless. Faith above life is faith that never dies. Yet historians debate this book. Some see it as theology more than history, devotion more than documentation. It ends not with political triumph, but with Judas' victory over Nicanor, around 161 BC, the moment when faith seems to stand tallest, before fading into centuries of silence. But silence is not absence. It is reflection. So pause here and ask yourself, would you die for what you believe? And if not, why is it so easy to live for lesser things? If this story moves you more deeply than any headline ever could, subscribe now. Don't let your heart remain silent. Because the story of the Maccabees isn't finished yet. It reaches beyond Judea, to another empire, another persecution, another miracle. Next, in 3 Maccabees, we travel to Egypt, where faith once again stands face to face with extinction. Chapter 3, 3 Maccabees, the Egyptian crisis and divine deliverance. The story now shifts, not to Judea, not to Jerusalem, but to the wide sands of Egypt. The 3rd book of Maccabees bears the same name, yet tells a different tale. It is not about Antiochus or the revolt of the Hasmoneans. Instead, it recounts a crisis faced by the Jewish people living in Egypt under the reign of Ptolemy IV Philopator, who ruled from 221 to 205 BC. The empire had changed, but the hatred remained. Once again, faith itself stood trial. After defeating Antiochus III in battle, Ptolemy IV turned his attention toward Jerusalem. Drunk with victory, he decided he would do what no foreign ruler had ever been allowed to do: enter the Holy of Holies within the temple of God. But as he stepped forward, pride swelling in his heart, something unseen struck him down. He fell to the ground, trembling and paralyzed. The priests watched as the king was carried out in terror. The God of Israel had defended his sanctuary once again. Yet humiliation breeds vengeance. Back in Alexandria, Ptolemy's fury ignited into madness, that he ordered that every Jew in Egypt be rounded up, branded, and forced to sacrifice to the Greek gods or die. Tens of thousands were imprisoned. Families were torn apart. Chains clattered through the streets as the faithful were dragged to the royal hippodrome, the arena where their fate would be sealed. And there, under the scorching sun, surrounded by guards and elephants prepared for execution, they prayed. They did not plead for escape. They pleaded for mercy and vindication, that the world might know that their God still reigned. What happened next defied every human explanation. The book of 3 Maccabees describes a divine intervention so sudden, so absolute, that even the oppressors trembled. As the king gave the order to trample the captives, the elephants turned wild, not against the Jews, but against their own masters. Panic swept through the soldiers. Confusion filled the air. The people who had been sentenced to death now stood untouched. And then silence. Ptolemy, terrified by what he saw, reversed his decree that he released the Jews, honored them publicly, and ordered their tormentors punished. Once again, God had intervened. The third book of Maccabees tells us that this victory was celebrated with a feast, not for triumph in battle, but for deliverance in exile. That it was a reminder that God's protection is not bound to geography. His reach extends beyond the hills of Jerusalem, to the deserts of Egypt, to the scattered diaspora, to every place where his name is still whispered. Unlike the first two books, there are no swords raised, no armies rallied. This is not a story of human might, but of divine mercy. The conflict is spiritual, a contest between pride and providence. Historians often debate this book. Some say it is a theological novel, shaped by oral legends and Greek literary style. Others call it a devotional drama, less about fact, more about faith. But its message is timeless, that even when the faithful are far from home, God's gaze still finds them. That even in the foreign lands of exile, he writes deliverance into their suffering. So let me ask you, when suffering happens far from home, when you feel unseen and unheard, do you still believe that God's eyes are on you? If you claim to follow a God who sees beyond borders, then show it. Hit subscribe, because this story deserves life beyond this video. And tell me in the comments, which miracle has moved you more so far? Was it the temple rescue in 2 Maccabees, or this deliverance in Egypt, when the hand of God turned beasts and kings alike? We've now crossed 3 eras: war, martyrdom, and exile. But the final chapter of this saga will take us beyond swords and miracles, into the realm of philosophy, where faith meets reason, and courage is not born of anger, but of understanding. Up next, 4 Maccabees, a plea for reason, virtue, and devotion. Chapter 4, 4 Maccabees, Reason, Passion, and Philosophical Theology. The fourth and final book of Maccabees stands apart, not a chronicle of war, not a record of miracles, but a sermon wrapped in philosophy. It does not recount armies or kings. It dissects the human soul. Scholars describe 4 Maccabees as a philosophical homily, a sermon written in the language of Greek reason, yet burning with Jewish conviction. That it was composed in Koine Greek, sometime in the 1st or early 2nd century AD, long after the Maccabean revolt, when Greek philosophy had already seeped deeply into the ancient world. Its ancient title was On the Sovereignty of Reason, and its central claim is as bold as any sword ever raised. Pious reason masters passion. The author argues that true wisdom, reason guided by faith, is not cold intellect, but the divine power to rule over the passions that enslave humanity. Fear, anger, grief, pleasure, these are the tyrants within us. And the highest victory is not over armies, but over ourselves. To prove this, the writer turns again to the martyrs of 2 Maccabees, the aged Eleazar and the mother with her 7 sons. But this time, their story is not told as tragedy. It is told as philosophy in flesh, the triumph of faith reason over pain, terror, and death. Eleazar, refusing to eat the forbidden meat, becomes the model of self-control, reason silencing the fear of agony. The 7 brothers and their mother become living proofs that devout reason can overcome even the body's scream for life. The book opens with long discussions about the nature of reason and passion, borrowing from Greek Stoic philosophy, yet transforming it. For the Stoics, reason alone could govern the passions. For the author of 4 Maccabees, reason must be pious, rooted in faith and obedience to God's law. He writes that sin and evil are not cosmic mysteries, but failures of self-control, lapses where passion dethrones reason. To disobey the Torah is to let the inner empire collapse. The text teaches that wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice, the classical virtues, are not Greek inventions, but divine attributes perfected in the faithful. And where 2 Maccabees spoke of bodily resurrection, 4 Maccabees leans toward another vision. The immortality of the soul. It declares that the righteous do not truly die. Their souls live on in eternal honor, while the wicked perish in shame. In this way, it bridges the worlds of Jerusalem and Athens, showing how Jewish faith could stand within Greek culture and yet remain unbroken. The author even dares to suggest that the martyrs' deaths were redemptive, that their suffering brought mercy upon the nation, cleansing it through their blood, a concept that would later echo through Christian thought. The innocent suffering for the many. Some scholars question whether the author truly understood Stoic doctrine or merely adopted its rhetoric to defend faith. Others see in it a remarkable synthesis, a blending of Greek philosophy and Hebrew revelation into one defiant message. Faith and reason are not enemies. They are allies in the pursuit of righteousness. 4 Maccabees became a favorite among early Christian thinkers, who found in it a bridge between the mind of Plato and the faith of the prophets. It was quoted in sermons, meditations, and moral treatises, proof that belief could stand firm even in the court of reason. So I ask you now, if reason is God's gift, are we using it or are we suppressing it? Do we let our passions rule us, our anger, our greed, our fear, or do we let faith reason lead? If you believe that faith should enlighten the mind, not blind it, then subscribe now, because this message must reach every thinker, every seeker, every believer struggling to balance conviction with understanding. The book of 4 Maccabees ends not in battle, not in blood, but in quiet triumph, reason enthroned over passion, the soul's victory over the body. And with it, our journey through the 4 books of Maccabees comes full circle, from revolt to martyrdom, from Egypt to philosophy, from the sword to the spirit. So now let's step back and look at what they leave behind, the legacy that shaped nations, inspired believers, and still whispers through time. What does it truly mean to be faithful under fire? Next, the final synthesis, what the 4 books of Maccabees teach us today. Chapter 5, Comparative Analysis and Theological Synthesis. Now that we have journeyed through the 4 books, let's step back and see the tapestry they weave together. 4 voices, 1 testimony. Though written across different generations and in different styles, each book of Maccabees answers the same question. What does it mean to remain faithful when faith costs everything? 1 Maccabees is history, a raw, factual chronicle of rebellion and courage. It shows faith expressed through action, through men and women who rose against tyranny when silence became sin. 2 Maccabees is theology, faith expressed through suffering, where miracles and martyrdom reveal that divine justice extends beyond the grave. 3 Maccabees is devotion, faith expressed through trust, when deliverance came not by sword or strategy, but by the unseen hand of God defending his people in exile. And 4 Maccabees is philosophy, faith expressed through reason, where the mind itself becomes the battlefield, and victory means mastering the passions that wage war within. Together, they form a complete picture of faith, not just lived but tested. Across the centuries, their canon and reception varied. The Jewish Bible preserved the memory of these events through tradition, but did not include the texts themselves in its canon. The Catholic and Eastern Orthodox churches embraced 1 and 2 Maccabees as deuterocanonical, sacred, inspired, preserved. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, with its wider canon, added even 3 Maccabees to its treasury of scripture. 4 Maccabees, though excluded from most official canons, lived on as a moral masterpiece, quoted by early Christian theologians, monks, and scholars, who saw in it the intellectual strength of faith. These books shaped how generations understood martyrdom, resurrection, intercession, and the endurance of the faithful. They bridged the gap between the Old and New Testaments, preparing hearts for the coming of one who would suffer not only for the law, but for the salvation of all. When we lay their teachings side by side, their harmony emerges. Faith and realism in 1 Maccabees, a reminder that God's people must sometimes act when others yield. Faith and endurance in 2 Maccabees, showing that even death can be a victory. Faith and hope in 3 Maccabees, proof that no exile is beyond God's sight. Faith and reason in 4 Maccabees, the revelation that true strength is mastery over oneself. Yet within that harmony, there's tension, the kind that makes faith real. The historian measures facts, the theologian seeks meaning, the philosopher weighs motives, the believer simply obeys, and somehow, in this tension, truth stands firm. Each book shows a different cost. 1 Maccabees demands courage. 2 Maccabees demands sacrifice. 3 Maccabees demands patience. 4 Maccabees demands discipline. Together, they teach that faith is not convenience, it is conviction. And what about us? Today, the battles may look different, but the temptations are the same: to compromise, to blend in, to silence conviction for comfort. These books call us back to the basics, to stand when pressured, to think deeply, to live faithfully, to remember that belief without reflection is fragile, and reflection without belief is empty. They remind us that identity under challenge defines who we are, that even in an age of confusion, conviction still matters. Their legacy endures because their message never aged. Faith is resistance. So I ask you, which of these books speaks most to you? Is it 1 Maccabees, calling you to fight for what's right? 2 Maccabees, reminding you that suffering refines the soul? 3 Maccabees, teaching that God still sees the forgotten? Or 4 Maccabees, challenging your reason and your passions? If your faith does not challenge you daily, then something is missing. Subscribe now, not for me, but so that these ancient voices, these witnesses of courage, can echo again in our generation. And tell me in the comments, which of the 4 books changed how you see your own faith journey? Because the story does not end here. One final chapter remains, a legacy, a warning, and a call that still demands an answer. We began with revolt, we walked through martyrdom, we escaped exile, and we sat at the feet of philosophy. The 4 books of Maccabees now stand before you, a tapestry of faith under fire. These are not distant tales buried in ancient scrolls. They are mirrors, showing us what devotion looks like when it costs everything, when comfort fades, and only conviction remains. The Maccabees didn't fight for recognition. They fought for remembrance, for the covenant, for truth, for God. And today, their stories ask you the same question they asked their own generation. What will you do when your faith is tested? If this video convicted you, inspired you, or even troubled you, don't let it fade into another scroll in your feed. Subscribe now, share it with someone whose faith needs rekindling, and comment below. Tell me your greatest takeaway, your first step forward, your declaration that faith still matters. Because if you walk away unchanged, then the words of the Maccabees die here, and with them, a testimony the world still needs. If you refuse to act, will your faith remain alive or silent? I leave you this final challenge. Let your life be your commentary on their witness. Live as if courage were still contagious. And now I ask you, when your faith is tested, will you choose the way of the Maccabees or the way of silence?